Hello, class. Welcome to the P word, an introduction to identifying, avoiding, and correcting plagiarism. In this module, we are tackling some of the trickiest aspects of integrating research into our writing. And one of the scariest of all of those aspects is probably plagiarism. Often we hear this word thrown around, maybe without really understanding what it means or how it happens. I always get kind of mixed results on whether people tell me they've heard this term before or they haven't. So I'm hoping in this video to really clarify the concept and maybe hopefully just a little lessen the fear that the word can strike in your heart. So we're going to start out with what plagiarism is and getting at some key terms. There's a lot of words we could throw at you, but there are going to be three major ones that I want you to pay attention to. Kind of three major terms that I think can be guiding forces for you as you are navigating plagiarism. First is knowing that the basic definition of plagiarism is using someone else's intellectual property, which means their words and or their ideas without proper acknowledgement. So it's not just about using words. It's also about ideas that we believe we credit as belonging to a certain person or group of people. So the question we're often asking is there a human or a group of humans who is alive now or has ever been alive that we see as being responsible for this information existing? And so we've always got to come back to, is it intellectual property that we can trace back to a specific person or group of people? So what that means is intellectual property, IP, includes statistics. Anytime you're giving me a percentage, a number of things, anything that had to be counted, somebody had to do that counting. So that's the intellectual property of some source. You might also be giving me results from a study, academic or otherwise. If we're learning this information because a study was conducted, then that study needs to get credit. Exact words are always intellectual property. So when you're quoting, always that using a source's exact words always counts as intellectual property. Original ideas or theories, those would count as intellectual property as well. Now, what intellectual property isn't is broad general observations or well-known facts. So again, if you say something like the sky is blue, well, there isn't a human being now or ever that we credit with being responsible for that idea. That's a broad general observation. Or George Washington was the first president of the United States. That's a well-known fact. There is not someone responsible for that idea being out in the world. So that's information that doesn't need to be cited, doesn't need to be considered intellectual property. So we've got to always remember intellectual property is that one of those terms I want you to remember. Now, there are exceptions, which brings us to the next term that I want you to remember, which is common knowledge. Common knowledge is when information, not words, information, has been used to a certain extent that we now believe it is part of the public domain, and it is no longer credited as belonging to an individual. Now, the problem is, how do you know whether something has reached that level? And in my experience, a lot of people are taught to define common knowledge by what they knew before they began research. And I think that is a really pretty terrible way to define common knowledge. Common knowledge really has nothing to do with what you know or what I know. Common knowledge has to do with the conversation. You know, we've talked about this conversation of research going on. Common knowledge has to do with what's happening in the conversation at large, not about ourselves individually. So you'll want to define it this way. If three or more of your sources include this information without citing it, then you can consider it common knowledge and you do not need to cite it either. And I encourage you to be very literal with that. Here is source 1, here is source 2, here is source 3. I have 3 sources that are giving me this information without citation. That's how you know something is common knowledge. So if your sources aren't doing that, it really doesn't matter whether you knew it in advance or not. If your sources aren't treating it like common knowledge, then you don't treat it like common knowledge. Your sources have to be your guide for this. So intellectual property, those are the things we need to cite, that we need to give credit to the people who are responsible for that information. Common knowledge is the exception. And I'll tell you, if you aren't sure whether something qualifies as common knowledge, I encourage you to just treat it as intellectual property. You're never going to, at least in my class, and I can't imagine ever in any others, you're not going to get in trouble for citing something that we probably would generally consider common knowledge. You will get in trouble for not citing something that needs to be. So I recommend erring on the side of caution. Common knowledge is an important exception, but if you're not sure, treat it as intellectual property. And finally, the other term that I want you to keep in your mind as we are working with source integration is good faith effort. This is the term we use at Kennesaw to identify what we think are actual issues of plagiarism and what might be mistakes. We do not expect you to be perfect at all of this your first time out of the gate. If we did expect that, then this class wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be spending time focusing on learning how to do this stuff if we thought you already knew how to do it. So it means I'm not looking for perfection in your citations. I'm not looking for perfection in your source integration, but I am looking for a good faith effort. Have you done everything within your power to do this work ethically and responsibly? That doesn't mean perfect, but it means you have made a good faith effort and you have done the things that I have taught you to do. So, if there's a punctuation in the wrong place, maybe some information out of order, those are things that could happen accidentally. But what we're looking for is, have you done everything that you have the knowledge of doing, you know, at this stage? And if so, then that qualifies as a good faith effort. So I recommend keeping that goal in mind rather than getting overwhelmed with maybe, is it going to be perfect? Because that's scary, I know. Now, teachers like me and schools like Kennesaw take plagiarism very seriously. It's important to do ethical work. That's one of the tenets of an academic institution. So the penalties for these can be pretty rough. Different classes are going to have different policies, so I always recommend reviewing the syllabus for your courses thoroughly, including mine. If you're not sure what my plagiarism policy is, I really recommend checking my syllabus. That is something you should be familiar with. We're also going to talk about how KSU handles these kinds of issues as an institution elsewhere. But for now, I want to remind you that these things are important. This is something the school takes seriously and something that we as individuals take seriously. If you do your own work, you want to get credit for your work and you want other people to not steal it from you. And that's what we're talking about here. We want to not steal from people. We want to treat intellectual property with as much respect as we would physical property. You know me and my metaphors. Sometimes I have silly metaphors, but if they're helpful for you, I'll give you my plagiarism metaphors. I often compare plagiarism to drunk driving or shoplifting. Both of these are activities that people could do hundreds of times without getting caught. In fact, in most cases, the first time someone gets caught for shoplifting is not the first time they've done it. But every time they do it, they run the same risk. Both are also activities that are not right, no matter how many people do them. So your friend doing it and getting away with it doesn't make it morally or ethically or anything right or responsible. And both of these are activities that are easy to avoid if you want to avoid them. So I think that's what plagiarism is like. You may have gotten away with it in the past, or other people you know may have gotten away with it in the past. That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make you safe from getting in trouble for it in the future. And also, if you don't want to do it, you can avoid it. Sometimes people, I think, get really scared. They think they're going to accidentally plagiarize and get kicked out of school, and that's just not the way things typically go. I have worked in plagiarism sanctions and violations and all that kind of stuff for many, many, many years. And what I see are not accidental periods in the wrong place kind of situations. So if you're careful and you know the rules, these are things you can avoid. So let's talk about what those rules are. There are really two basic rules to avoiding plagiarism. And I say this every semester, and so far no one has told me I'm wrong about this, so I will keep saying it until someone tells me I'm wrong. If you find out that I'm wrong, let me know. But in my experience, I have never seen or heard about a plagiarism sanction, a plagiarism accusation, a plagiarism case where one of these two rules wasn't violated. In other words, if you can follow both of these rules, I feel safe saying you won't get in trouble for plagiarism. These are the basic rules if you can get these two down. So take all the complexity you hear about plagiarism, let's boil it down to the two basic rules. This is number one. Quote whenever you use a source's exact words. If you did not write the words, stick quotation marks around them. It doesn't matter where you found the words. For instance, if you get a dictionary definition and you include that in your essay, you did not write the dictionary. Those words are not yours. Put quotation marks around them. I think of quoted material as similar to like a copy and paste on the computer. It's what you've highlighted and you're saying from this point to this point, the open quotation marks to the end quotation marks. These words are not mine. These come from someone else. There is a lot of gray area with source integration. It is tough, it is confusing, it can be subjective, it can be up for debate, it can make you lose your mind. There's all kinds of tough stuff with this, but quotation marks is not one of the tough things. This is black and white. If you did not write the words, quotation marks belong around them. And I'm hitting on this point a lot, and I know that this is probably not the first time you've heard this rule, but in my experience, it is somewhat shocking to me how many times I'll be in plagiarism hearings with people, and they'll say they didn't know this. So I want to make it abundantly clear to you. If you have any questions about this, please let me know, but quotation marks exist to identify words that are not yours. We're going to talk about citing in a minute, and then onward and for the rest of our semester. Citing gets tough, but citing and quoting, they don't cancel each other out. Citing doesn't mean you don't quote. Quoting happens every time across the board, every time you use a source's exact words. So that's basic rule number one. Basic rule number two is citing. You cite whenever you use information from an outside source. Whether you're quoting, summarizing, or paraphrasing, you're gonna cite it. That way we know what source gave you this information. Now again, even if you're citing, if you're using a source's exact words, you still got to quote. But if you're quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing, you have to cite. So the citation tells me this idea came from this source. Quotation marks tell me these exact words came from a source. So I need both things if you're quoting, and I need citing if you're paraphrasing or summarizing. Again, two basic rules. Follow these, and I don't think you'll have a problem. But here are some other tips that might help. Take time with your work. I know I'm so teacherly to say, don't wait till the last minute, but it's true. When you wait till the last minute to do work, you're more likely to make a mistake that could be costly. And you're also more likely to make a panic decision that you wouldn't make if you were clearer of head. So best thing I can tell you is to take time with your work. So many times when people are in plagiarism hearings, they say, I just ran out of time. I waited until the last minute. I panicked. Well, don't do that to yourself. Don't panic. Don't make yourself get to that situation. And then you'll be more likely to avoid these issues. Also, ask questions if you aren't sure. Again, I don't expect all of this to be perfect right now. So I expect you to have questions. I am a good resource to ask these questions of. Asking questions up front will help a lot. I also recommend marking your source material as you take notes. If something is coming from if you're using a source's exact words, put it in quotes. If you're summarizing or paraphrasing in your notes, note that. Marking the source material will make it easier for you to remember later on where you found things and which words are yours. Sometimes that stuff can get harder the farther away you get from the day you did research. And in our course, you might do research at the beginning of the semester and then not use that source until later. And so you need to remember what you might not be able to remember otherwise, and making notes. Keep marking the source material as you make notes. That makes a big difference. As does keeping track of the bibliographical information of your sources. What page did you find this information on? What website, the exact address. You would not believe how much time people waste tracking down their sources. Attributing your sources, saying things like, according to psychologist Bob Smith, blah, 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 blah. According to the Centers for Disease Control, blah, 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 blah. Attributing, naming your sources inside your essay, that's part of that good faith effort. It's kind of like you're waving your hands and you're saying, look, this information didn't come from me. It came from someone else. And that can be a good piece of insurance. If you are summarizing and paraphrasing, be very intentional to compare your passages with the original, just to make sure you're not using part of the original without realizing that you're doing it. Save and back up all drafts. I've told you this before, but I have an email address that exists only as a dumping ground for my drafts. So that when I finish something, I send it to myself so that my house could burn down, my computer could die, every horrible thing could happen, and I could still be able to access my work. I recommend doing something similar. So as we continue through this module, we're going to keep chipping away at what this is, what plagiarism is, how we prevent it. You'll read about some plagiarism cases we'll discuss. You'll get familiar with the KSU policy. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. That's what I'm here for, and this is stuff that it's likely you're going to have questions about. So you can't hesitate to raise your hand and let me know you need some help. All right, well, I look forward to working through the rest of this module. We are going to conquer plagiarism.